Hi, this is Eternal King here, bringing you another Elden Ring video. As stated previously, we are taking a little break from LOR as we're waiting on some balance patches and I would say champion and archetype updates. That is something that would happen quite frequently with the last team of LOR developers, in the last director. We're not seeing it as much with the new director, but hopefully I'm still optimistic that will happen at some point. Because again, I do love LOR, I want to keep playing the game, but in the meantime, let's talk about what's new, and that is Shadow of the Erdtree. So I have beaten Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, Elden Ring DLC, 7 times, and I've proceeded to get engaged in the co-op experience, helping the community get through the boss fights, which is the hardest content in a Souls game to date. And I've been helping. I've also been doing some PvP as well. So I'm going to comment on the new spells that were introduced in Shadow of the Erdtree, as well as the old spells. I'm going to talk about what the best spells are per category. Starting off with sorceries, we have Miriam's Vanishing. Miriam's Vanishing is very interesting because it is an iframe dodge with a massive amount of mobility and invincibility frames. So the fact that mages can now teleport through something like a Dragon Breath attack is very good for mages. So Bale is one of the toughest fights in the DLC. Once he, basically breathes fire anywhere in your general direction, you can just teleport through that. So pretty good spell. Talking about some other big winners, Renala's Twin Moon is exceptionally damaging. Obviously, it's better for PvE than PvP, but what it does is it summons 3 AoEs that all basically proc for damage separately. And if you don't know, you can scale up your sorcery rating very high in Elden Ring, and therefore this spell that is essentially going to hit the ground 3 times is going to do a massive amount of damage. Other big winners, I would say Blades of Stone. Blades of Stone is very similar to an attack that one of the most irritating enemies in the core game would use, and it basically shoots out rocks from the earth. And if you charge the spell, it'll do it 3 times. It can do a massive amount of damage in the DLC, and it can basically eat bosses' life bars just through charged casts of Blades of Stone. So I highly recommend using this spell. The next big winner is Gravitational Missile. So Gravitational Missile is both good for PvE and PvP. You can shoot it into the ground to cause the missile to explode instantly, or you can just aim it normally through the lock-on, and it will basically draw in enemies through gravitational pulses and then explode. Either use case is very strong, exceptionally useful spell. It's basically the only crowd control spell sorcerers get in the game. Impenetrable Thorns is the new bleed sorcery. So we've already talked about in the last video that bleed weapons are good. Well, this is a bleed spell, and it generally overperforms all other bleed sorceries currently. So it's exceptionally powerful. I would say that it's probably overtuned with the way it's working right now, because it basically procs bleed instantly on any boss, which usually you have to cast a couple spells to do that. Spectral Rings of Light, this is the new death sorcery, very powerful, summons a bunch of slow homing projectiles, and death sorcerers are also just kind of very good at summoning slow moving projectiles that home in on you, so the fact that you can just spam more of them is very powerful. Vortex of Putrescence, this is really cool. It's kind of like a firestorm for death sorcerers. It basically rains fire all around you, and it's going to do big damage to bosses. It's going to do big damage in PvP, assuming that opponents don't just roll out of it as soon as they see you starting the animation, which they probably will. Master Putrescence, this is the same as a spell called Cannon of Hama, but it's for death sorcerers. And if you don't know, Cannon of Hama is an amazing spell, therefore this is an amazing spell. Next up, we have Fleeting Microcosm. Fleeting Microcosm is a boss killer in PvE. I would argue that it is about on par. It's not as broken as the bleed sorcery that we just went over. But in terms of functioning as intended, pound for pound damage into a boss, it is the best. Light casts as fast as you tap your finger will proc 2 separate explosions every time you use this spell. So it's a top tier sorcery spell for PvE and co-op. Moving on to the new incantations, I'm going to pick some of the big winners here. In terms of what I've seen, Knight's Lightning Spear, absolutely fantastic for lightning builds. It's basically a multi-shot lightning spear, which makes it one of the best lightning spells in the game. Good damage, good chance to hit in PvE and PvP. Next up, we have multi-layered Ring of Light. It is one of the best disc throwing spells in the game. You essentially throw the disc, and it will do the DBZ thing where it turns into a big rotating saw and continues to damage proc as the saw cuts into enemies. It is one of the best holy damage spells in the game currently. Talking about other useful spells, I would say Giant Golden Arc is a big winner. So Giant Golden Arc essentially being this massive, wide tracking projectile that you can just spam. Even the charge casts can be spammed very, very fast, and they do an exceptional amount of damage in holy builds. And if you're, PvEing solo or you're PvEing to help others beat bosses, this projectile is one of the best you can spam. If you're a mage, your job is to sit there and just hold R1 over and over again, and so this is the kind of tracking projectile you want to be using. Talking about some of the legacy stuff that's exceptionally powerful, we mentioned the Spells of Hama, so we'll go over both of these. Cannon of Hama does a massive amount of poise damage and has a massive AoE. It is essentially an artillery spell. It arcs, and then it explodes, and it does massive damage. You can see, when charged, deals sorcery scaling times 3.32. So that's a lot. It's a lot of sorcery scaling modifier that goes into this one spell. So big cannon spell. Gavel of Hama. This is really good soloing as a mage because it essentially pancakes things. So it's a melee range spell, but because it's a hammer, it insta-pancakes, and you can cast it twice. So very, very strong. Even had its FP reduced at one point, so pretty nice. Talking about other useful spells, talking about something that was nerfed. Common of Azure, don't want to use this anymore. So if you remember core game, Elden Ring, you could essentially beat the whole thing, or at least all the way to endgame, with Common Azure spam, which is a channeled spell that shoots a big laser beam, like a Kamehameha kind of thing. In the DLC, this is really bad now. So they nerfed the infinite mana exploit. It's not an exploit, but it was a tier you could use in your flask, a temporary buff, and that would last 15 seconds and give you infinite mana for that period of time. Now it's only 10 seconds. So you only get the laser for 10 seconds, and bosses are so aggressive now that in the DLC, it's so much harder in the DLC, that you won't even get to stand there and channel this. So don't bother with Common Azure anymore. Stars of Ruin was also nerfed, but it's okay. I would say that it's fine. It's hot. It's a lot of projectiles, and it has good tracking. If you want to spam Stars of Ruin, it's still fine, in my opinion. Talking about other super useful spells. Good old-fashioned Renala's Full Moon. So again, you see the animation here. Summons a moon with a lot of tracking, and it's slow-moving, and it does a ton of damage. And so in PvE, because, even if bosses move, the projectile is slow enough that it will adjust mid-flight, you're going to be landing these moons on enemies. So this is one of the best spells you can spam. In a kind of co-op scenario where you're not being pressured because you have your warrior-type classes, or builds tanking the boss for you. So if you have people tanking the boss for you, just spam full charge Renala's moons into the boss, and that's the best thing you can do as a sorcerer, beyond using the Thorn sorcery, which is overtuned right now. Duelist Moonblade, still amazing. So we talked about bleed a lot. Frostbite is the exact same thing as bleed. It slows enemies down, and it procs a ton of HP damage right off the top, and a Duelist Moonblade does that. And it does it as a melee spell. So again, one of the best spells you can spam as a sorcerer, 100%. Talking about other useful spells, Zamor Ice Storm is pretty nice still. Zamor Ice Storm is a much faster AoE than the one we got in the DLC. You can just tap it out, and then it basically creates a Frostbite Storm centered around your character. It's a great like get off me button. It's good for PvP and PvE as like a spacing tool, a Frostbite proc tool, a damage tool. It does it all. Talking about Meteorite of Estelle, I just mentioned that the tier that gives you infinite mana was recently nerfed. So, by extension, this sorcery is kind of nerfed as well. So, you need to have a lot FP sustainability to channel this bad boy. But sure, you know, in a co-op scenario where you have people taking the boss for you, you can just sit here and channel this, and it's going to hit more and basically land better than Common Azure because of it being a wide multi-projectile attack. I would definitely use Meteorite of Estelle over Common Azure as your channeling spell of choice. And then some of the older death sorceries, Ancient Death Rancor being another one of those slow-moving tracking projectiles that is so good for death sorcerers. It's kind of their thing. Moving on to incantations, there are a lot of very powerful incantations that scale well into the DLC content. So, Crucible Tail is one of my favorites for soloing as an incantation user, and the reason why is because it's melee range and it hard staggers and does a ton of poise damage to bosses. So if you're comfortable being at melee range with these DLC bosses, a charged aspect of the Crucible Tail is going to be very good for knocking down bosses as well as, you know, Black Knights and larger enemies and things like that. Horns is kind of similar, but it's a charging attack, so you charge it up at a distance, and then you will essentially send enemies flying in PvE. Again, in PvP, the application of these spells is greatly reduced because the number of things that is good in PvP is greatly reduced in general. But in PvE, these spells are quite strong still. I would still recommend using, for soloers, aspect of the Crucible Tail, aspect of the Crucible Horns. Black Blade. Black Blade's amazing. So again, you can see the animation here, and it's actually better in the DLC than it is in core game, because the way that it works is it continues to sap a percentage of HP from bosses. So because the HP pools are bigger, Black Blade will actually sap more HP than it would otherwise. So it reduces the enemy's max HP by 10%. 10% max HP reduction into a DLC boss is sometimes measured in the thousands of HP. It's very, very good. Talking about the old Golden Order spells, obviously in PvE, something like Radagon's Ring of Light is massive damage for a holy build, so still recommend if you're going that kind of, 50-50, 40-40, Intel Faith split, then Rings of Light is a pretty good go-to for damage. And triple Rings of Light, somewhat worse than the new Ring of Light spell we got. The Destructo Disc is kind of better than triple Rings of Light, but the nice thing about this is that it's basically guaranteed to hit, and that's the only thing it has going for it. It's a very high FP cost for a projectile that does so little damage, but because it's so wide and there's 3 of them, you're pretty much guaranteed to hit. So it's like a good finisher for certain things. If you just want to throw a projectile out that is going to hit 100% of the time and not deal that much damage, it's great for that. Talking about other useful spells that have scaled well, obviously any of this sort of lightning stuff that you're doing is going to still be good. So Death's Lightning, Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike, Lassiex's Glaive, Fortius's Lightning Spear. All this stuff is kind of like your go-tos for lightning builds, and it's all still fine. Talking about fire spells, obviously Giant's Flame Take Thee, best fireball spell in the game. Does massive damage in the DLC. It is so much damage that it's hard to express. It's basically 3.6k or 3.6 thousand, which is a lot, or 3.8k depending. It's a lot of damage for a fireball. Flame of the Fell God being a slow-moving projectile that is nice to throw out there and will knock opponents down with its tracking. It will also cause a damage over time effect on the ground. Obviously really bad in PvP. Same thing with the other Fireball, but in PvE, these spells are still stonks. Some other stuff. Swarm of Flies is nice because, again, it does cause bleed at a range. So you will see people spam Swarm of Flies into the DLC bosses. But the thing about bleed is that bleed does a lot of damage up front. But then bosses will increase their resistance to bleed over time. So the first proc is super easy and will likely get you to stage 2. And then you'll find that after that you need to switch to something else because you're no longer procking bleed. That's the way it's supposed to work. So Swarm of Flies starts out really good in the fight and then gets really bad by the end. It feels like you're doing nothing. Talking about the Frenzy Flame spells, obviously Unendurable Frenzy is still super nice. Due to the multi-hit projectiles and being able to walk forward with this, it's going to be good for PvP and PvE. I think Undurable Frenzy is still very strong. Lots of damage, lots of projectiles, lots of poise damage, and stagger potential. Just everything you could want. Obviously Madness build-up in PvP, that sort of thing. Talking about the Dragon's Breath spells, which is kind of the end of the list, I personally really like Glintstone Breath. It has a very low channeling FP cost relative to the other breath spells. It deals magic damage, which means that you can buff its damage up until to the moon, essentially. And so, also, the fact that the animation is shorter than some of the stronger breath attacks matters a lot in the DLC. You don't want to stick there and commit to a Dragon's Breath attack if the animation is going to take 20 years if you're soloing the DLC content like I did. Dragon's Claw, staple spell for dragon builds. Slap an enemy to the ground and do it twice. Obviously great for PvE. And Dragon's Maw being your other melee range dragon spell, but it deals more damage, and the damage can be exceptionally high. If you hit with the Maw, it deals roughly 50% more damage. So if you land the snapping of the teeth exactly where you're supposed to, the damage is massive. So it's like a critical, dragon's bite kind of thing. And of course, the last one we have here is Placidus Dux's Ruin. that's a tough dragon name, but he basically shoots out lasers, and the lasers go all around. So if I was in a co-op scenario, I would want someone to be rocking this spell, because it's just you cast it, and then it's going to do so much damage to the boss in a co-op scenario that you're basically hard carrying as a caster at that point. Just going to double check through, see if there's anything else I think is worth highlighting. Obviously, you have like your bestial incantations, which aren't bad. You have your nobles incantations, which aren't bad. Something like Black Flame Ritual is an okay get off me button. It's not terrible. But there's a lot of competition in incantations, because out of all the spell categories in the game, there's more incantations than anything else. So the bar is very high. But we can talk about Divine Beast Tornado, which is one of the new incantations, and it's quite strong. It summons a tornado that will essentially proc damage multiple times. So for that reason, it's hard not to recommend Divine Beast Tornado as both a PvE and PvP spell. Bale's Tyranny is a roar spell, so again, the dragon roars and it causes a firestorm-like effect around you. Again, these types of spells are very good in PvE. They are not very good in PvP, because in PvE, all of those damage procs will likely land and hit the boss and deal massive damage. Meanwhile, in PvP, someone's just going to roll to the other side of the arena and not care. And what else? We got some new healing spells. So, again, if you do want to roleplay as a cleric, we do have Heal from Afar. if you're running a cleric build or a healing build in Elden Ring, you should be running heal from afar versus anything else, because it's the only spell in the game currently that allows you to heal at a distance, which is something clerics should be doing to keep their team alive if you are co-oping currently. So again, that's a great help if you want to run this spell in a co-op scenario where bosses are going to have, much longer health bars than when you're soloing, and actually health sustainability matters. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good overview of some of the strongest spells in the game. Last one might be Mesmer's Orb. I think Mesmer's Orb is the only new fire spell worth using in the DLC, and it is exactly what the boss does. You fly up into the air, you jam this orb directly at your opponent, and then it explodes. And if it hits with both the initial contact and the explosion, it's going to deal massive damage. So that's the last one I want to highlight. Yeah, so this has been Eternal King, talking about some of the best spells that you can use in Elden Ring, stuff that is good in the DLC, that will take you through endgame, whether you're soloing or you're helping other people through the content. These are some spells you want to look out for.